Hello, thank you for listening today. In light of the Senate Finance Committee's release of their proposed Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act last week, today it's July 31st, we're recording this. We just wanted to provide not just a summary of the key points of that proposal, but also some ideas on impacts and what might happen going forward here. We should couch this with saying this is a Senate Finance Committee proposal. It still has to get through the full Senate. So, what happens next at some level is anybody's guess. But nonetheless, we wanted to provide some initial quick thoughts, not go too crazy with conjecture or anything like that. And as things evolve with this, we'll look forward to providing some more thinking around it as more things are released and this develops further. Again, about Akara, we play in this market access and government pricing space and have been doing so for a long time. And you can visit our website, akaragroup.com, if you want to learn more about us. So what we will cover today is background of this PDPRA initiative, some of the key proposals and impacts, and just some thinking around what comes next. What we won't cover are any provisions of the initiative that don't directly impact manufacturer price reporting or reimbursement. So there were some provisions in there around disclosures that have to be made by PBMs on their Part B contracting and some other items. We're not going to get into those things. And also, of course, we won't get into any legal interpretations or perspectives as we are not a law firm. Quick background again. On July 23rd, the Senate Finance Committee introduced this Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act. We'll keep calling it the PDPRA. It was introduced by a bipartisan Senate team of the committee leader, Senator Grassley, and the ranking Democratic member, Ron Wyden. And on July 25th, they advanced it out of committee by a vote of 19-9, both Democratic and Republican support, and a bunch of Republicans voting against it. There were a bunch of amendments that came in on the markup, 110 amendments, with only a few that were actually voted on. We'll get into some information about that a little later on. Regarding the parts of the PDPRA we're going to talk about today, we kind of group them into 5 categories in terms of areas they impact: price transparency, expanding drug coverage, Part D benefit design and coverage, reimbursement changes, and manufacturer liabilities and price reporting. So we're going to touch on each of these 5 areas in the subsequent slides here. Okay, we'll start with the items affecting manufacturer liabilities and price reporting. The way we organize this table, on the left there's that laundry list of initiatives that came out of the proposal from the Senate Finance Committee. There's a few key takeaways, so I'm going to focus on those, and you can kind of follow the list on the left as we discuss them a bit. Number 1, with the Part B program. With respect to Part B, there were a bunch of mechanisms that are proposed to be imposed on the manufacturer to lower the basis of reimbursement to providers, to really cut Medicare budget outlays is the end goal at the end of the day. For example, requiring manufacturers that do not have national drug rebate agreements with Medicaid to submit an ASP. Without an ASP, reimbursement is based on WAC, so presumably a slightly higher rate. So by requiring the ASP on those drugs, you're therefore lowering reimbursement, theoretically. Also, requiring an inflation penalty on based on a benchmark ASP, and excluding biosimilars and vaccines, notably from this requirement. So almost promoting the use of biosimilars while also imposing price controls on the ASP itself. Further, including the value of coupons as a deduction to Part B ASP. What would this mean for best price? We know that ASP exclusions have traditionally been based on best price inclusions. So would this have some sort of cursory impact on best price? Certainly a legal question, but maybe something worth thinking about. And finally, a proposed statutory definition of bona fide service fees, prohibiting, for example, percentage of sales-based fees. This would likely require a reevaluation of fair market value assessment policies and with a resulting impact in government pricing, affect forecasted Medicaid rebates and ASP reimbursement levels. Switching gears on the Part D side, the elimination of the Part D coverage gap rebate through the benefit redesign would change the extent of manufacturer Part D rebate liabilities, potentially a more predictable rebate on the catastrophic care side, because it's just more straightforward. Once the patient hits catastrophic care, you're paying a 20% rebate if you're the manufacturer. The coverage gap rebate has historically been more complicated, including what counts against true out-of-pocket costs versus what doesn't, so on and so forth. Here it's pretty simple. Once you hit catastrophic care, all those outlays, the manufacturer is paying 20% of them. Therefore, maybe it's simpler to administer. And what would the resulting impact be to your organization that's currently managing the coverage gap process? So also some organizational and process considerations to keep in mind. Finally, they also have proposed inflation-based, CPIU-based list price controls, which should only apply to Part D sales. So the extent of your gross net impact would depend on your payer mix. If you're heavy Part D, this could be more substantive. If you're light Part D on your portfolio or on your product, then this may not be as impactful to you. And finally, on the Medicaid side, a few things proposed. One, the Secretary of HHS is authorized to audit manufacturer price submissions, such as AMP, and charge civil monetary penalties if the manufacturer fails to provide that information. Also, the manufacturer would be required to report WAC to HHS, which would be made public. They also increased the CMPs, existing CMPs for Medicaid price reporting delays to $50,000 on the first day of delay versus the current $10,000, and $19,000 for each subsequent day that it's late. On the AMP side, they would exclude authorized generics from AMP, which can potentially increase Medicaid rebate liability, and also cap URA at 125% of AMP, with some nuances also as to when the rebate cap would apply and when it would not apply, and merits further digging if this thing advances to the Senate any further. Okay, moving on to some other areas. In the section we called expanding drug coverage, the PDPRA proposed expanding definitions of Medicaid covered outpatient drugs to include the option of the state any drug which as part of a bundled payment if it is provided on an outpatient basis, even if it's incident to physician services or outpatient hospital services. The point here is a drug that has historically been excluded from the Medicaid COD definition would be included. That would increase Medicaid rebate liabilities via increased utilization. And also, we know that if you participate in Medicaid, those covered outpatient drugs must be offered at 340B price. So could this potentially increase 340B program liabilities as well? Okay, let's move to Part D benefit redesign. And number one, summarizing what the proposal is, it proposes that the enrollee pays 100% in the initial coverage phase of their plan, a 25-75 split while in the coverage gap phase, 75% being paid by the plan, and then importantly, the enrollee would pay nothing in catastrophic coverage, as opposed to the 5% today. The manufacturer, as we mentioned earlier, would pay 20% in catastrophic. The plan would pay 20%, Medicare would pay 60%. This is starting in 2022. Notably, the idea is by 2024, that would flip. The plan would pay 60%, Medicare would pay 20%. So again, there's that emphasis on cutting Medicare budget outlays. Further, the patient out-of-pocket costs are capped at $3,100. The second thing on the Part D side is making permanent the low-income net program, which provides LIS lives temporary Part D coverage between the time they became LIS and their actual Part D plan took effect. So this would make that, again, permanent as part of this proposed law. So some impacts. Medicare program liabilities for Part D are essentially being redistributed to the private sector plan and the manufacturer. You could reason to think that the patient out-of-pocket cap of $3,100 leads to more predictable spending for the enrollee and easing their ability to manage their health insurance budget a little bit. Manufacturer liability forecasting could be a little less complicated. We know the coverage gap and its various mechanisms to calculate and project the discount. It's a little more complicated than what seems to be a slightly more straightforward 20% of all catastrophic coverage costs to be placed on the manufacturer in this proposal. And expansion of LIS live coverage window via the low-income net plan presumably increases plan liabilities for those enrollees that require such coverage. Let's move to overall reimbursement impact. So we talked about the impact to the manufacturer's price reporting, manufacturer prices, to the Part D benefit redesign. Now let's talk about on the reimbursement side to providers and pharmacies. Especially on the Part B side is where the impact, where this is most focused. A statutory WAC plus 3% Part B reimbursement for products without ASP would be in place. So essentially launch products. This was done via a rulemaking as of January 1, 2019, so this would make this permanent. It would set a maximum add-on payment of $1,000. So in other words, if ASP plus 6% reimbursement, that 6% equals a $2,000 add-on, well then it would be capped at $1,000. After 2028, that $1,000 would adjust up by CPIU. On the biosimilar side, they would make the initial reimbursement at product launch the lower of WAC plus 3% or the reference product's ASP plus 6%, and it would also add a temporary 5-year increase of reimbursement to ASP plus 8% of the reference product's ASP. So for any biosimilar, basically for a 5-year period from its introduction to 5 years out, a slightly higher reimbursement rate, 8% versus 6% for the add-on payment. And finally, switching gears to the Medicaid side, it would require pass-through pricing in Medicaid if the pharmacy, for example, in the PBM wants to receive federal matching funds. So this was addressed a little bit in rulemaking earlier this year via saying that the pass-through rebates that a PBM receives should not be factored into medical loss ratio calculations. So in other words, you can't account for spread pricing in that. This is trying to make it statutory and also putting an impact of saying federal matching funds would be withheld if pass-through pricing is not performed and the PBM is benefiting from spread pricing. So ultimately, at the end of the day, looking to lower Medicaid outlays to the Medicaid program, which is ultimately funded by the taxpayer. Also on the transparency side, would ask Secretary of HHS to do a survey of RCP prices, retail community pharmacy prices, that include the NADAC, and also do reports on specialty drug coverage and reimbursement, including NADAC capture. So it's really trying to see and learn a little more about what the NADAC is capturing, now that the NADAC is so widely used as the basis of reimbursement for many state Medicaid programs, looking to learn more about it and supposedly evolve it and expand on how it's being used. So again, in summary, in Part B, there's some tightening of the CMS budget for reimbursement while also apparently encouraging biosimilar utilization, seems to be the goal here. And then on the Medicaid side, attempting to address criticisms of lack of transparency in net prices realized by pharmacies, and of course curtailing that spread pricing. The final group, federal price transparency. The reporting would require certain disclosures by manufacturers and justifications for price increases that exceed certain thresholds for different types of products over a rolling 12-month period. New drugs with annual list price exceeding gross spending required to cross Part D out-of-pocket thresholds, so approximately $10,000 in 2022 for that out-of-pocket threshold, and would impose civil monetary penalties of $10,000 per day for failure to report and $100,000 for a false claim by a manufacturer. In essence, seems very similar to various state laws, state price transparency laws that have been enacted. California and Oregon come to mind. And I guess, if this was to go through, what would this mean for individual state laws? Is this, in addition to that, would this cause the states to rethink what they're requesting manufacturers to report? Is there a true crossover? That, this would be kind of the devil's in the details a bit about how this thing expands and fleshes out. But on first read, it sounds very similar to what some of the states have done. Okay, so wrapping up a bit, that's a summary of the provisions, some of the thoughts and impact we had. There were amendments made in the Senate Finance Committee markup, 110 of them. A few were voted on, and here's some key ones that were voted on but rejected by the committee. One was removing the inflation penalty and list price for Part D utilization. It was proposed that this is a price control and should be removed, but the committee decided to keep it in there for the bill that's, would move to the Senate floor. There was an amendment to block the administration's Part B International Price Index proposed rulemaking. That was also rejected. And there was an amendment to insert in negotiating Medicare Part C and Medicare Advantage and Part D prices with manufacturers. That was also rejected out. Some other quote-unquote hot topics that the proposal doesn't address. It doesn't really touch pricing for the employer-sponsored insurance side, which is really still a huge portion of our country's insured population. So while this would put some cost and price controls on Medicaid and Medicare, there's still a large portion of the population that would really be largely unaffected by many of these measures. No mention of 340B. 340B is the hot topic of the decade in many ways when it comes to our little industry, but there's really nothing on it. There's some indirect impacts that we might see on it, for example, expanding the definition of a Medicaid-covered outpatient drug, but nothing to talk about controlling 340B transparency, diversion, duplicate discounting, all the things that we tend to worry about. And it doesn't address point-of-sale discounts to patients. The safe harbor, the removal of safe harbor protections for Part D rebates was withdrawn. And, while this doesn't address it, Grassley did say that he wants to pursue something on this, and Wyden agreed that it needs to be addressed. So, we should keep an eye out for whether as they move this to the Senate, whether they decide to do something more in this area. Talking dollars, so to speak, the CBO says that this measure could save $100 billion to taxpayers over 10 years, $85 billion from Medicare, $15 billion in Medicaid, and save $32 billion to beneficiaries, $27 billion on the cost share side, $5 billion in premiums. So what's going on in the House of Representatives? Pelosi and the Democratic majority apparently are set to release their own price reduction plan in the months to come. Given the Democratic majority, we could expect, some aggressive measures there. For example, maybe they will include something on price negotiation for Medicare, but of course we don't know anything yet, and it's something to monitor, and ultimately how this will interact with whatever is going on in the Senate. And what will the Senate do? We don't know, right? This is, the next step would be to have something from the Senate Finance Committee markup to be brought to the floor to a vote. There's significant Republican opposition and lobbyist action from places like pharma. So whether the whole thing makes it to the floor or a piece of it, such as Part D benefit redesign, is something to watch for and just monitor and understand. It's also noteworthy that other proposals have been introduced today, July 31st. The We Paid Act was introduced that looks to put some drug price controls on for a very particular set of drugs that have NIH funding and are jointly researched and funded via, through government partnership with the NIH. So without getting more detail in that act, there are other individuals in the Senate that are looking to address this, and in the House as well. So how all this comes together is going to make for probably a pretty complicated and drawn-out process, as it usually tends to be. So with all of this, what should manufacturers do? There's a little bit of just be aware. Don't go too crazy modeling anything. If Part D is a huge portion of your portfolio, or if the ASP is a significant consideration for you, you may want to do some rudimentary modeling to understand the what-if impacts of some of these for planning purposes and discussion and strategic conversations. But to get involved in a very deep dive process, maybe a little bit premature. I think we need to see a little bit more about what the Senate decides to do with this. But it's good to be aware and good to kind of understand the broad strokes and some of the details of where this is headed. And with that, we'll connect again when there's more to talk about. But we hope this was informative for everybody right now. Thank you.